The year 1886 had decided to bleed the warmth from the Arizona territory with a peculiar cruelty. In Redemption Creek, a town that clung to the dusty earth like a stubborn burr, the cold was a foreign trespasser. It laid a thin, almost apologetic layer of snow over the warped planks of the boardwalks and the shingled roofs, a white sheet on a feverish body. The saguaros on the surrounding mesas stood like frozen sentinels, their arms lifted to a sky the color of slate. Christmas was a whisper on the wind, a notion from a kinder world that had little business in a place where men still settled their differences with iron and lead. The piano in the dusty lantern saloon played a tinny, cheerful tune that was drowned out by the boisterous laughter of prospectors and ranch hands who preferred the gospel of whiskey to any carol. Caleb Monroe felt the cold deep in his bones, a familiar ache that mirrored the one in his soul. He cinched the worn leather strap on his saddle, his knuckles raw and red against the biting air. His small ranch was nestled a few miles from the noise of the town, a quiet patch of ground he had fought for not with a gun, but with the sweat of his brow and a silence that kept his neighbors at a respectful distance. He was a man built of long lines and hard angles, his face weathered by a sun and a past that had offered little shade. Most folks in Redemption Creek knew of him, or rather, they knew the stories that clung to him like alkali dust. They knew he had once ridden with the Red Spurs, a name that still made lawmen spit and mothers pull their children close. What they did not know was the man who now rose before the sun to mend fences and spoke more to his horse, dust, than to any human being. They did not see the way his hands, capable of a lightning-fast draw, could be gentle as he cleared a stone from a tender hoof. A scar, a pale, jagged line, circled his left wrist, disappearing under the cuff of his shirt. It was a permanent reminder of a misspent youth, a brand from a life he had deserted 5 years ago. He ran a thumb over it, the skin smooth and dead. Sometimes he felt it was the only honest part of him left, a truth etched in flesh that no amount of quiet living could erase. He swung himself into the saddle, the leather groaning a complaint against the cold. He had a few pelts to trade in town, a necessity that forced him from his solitude. As he urged dust toward the distant, hazy lights of Redemption Creek, he pulled his collar high, his gaze sweeping the horizon out of a habit he could not break. Trouble, he had learned, rarely announced its arrival. In the center of town, in a small, sturdy building with barred windows and a sign that read, Marshal, Lydia Marshal poured a measure of laudanum into a glass of water. Her movements were precise, economical, a reflection of a mind that had been sharpened by an education in the East. She had returned to this rugged land 6 months prior, trading the structured lecture halls of Boston for the dusty confines of her father's office. At 22, she possessed a quiet fortitude that often wrong-footed the men who saw only her fine-boned features and the gentle curve of her mouth. Her hair, the color of dark honey, was pinned back in a severe style that failed to tame the rebellious curls at her temples. She wore a simple wool dress, its practicality a stark contrast to the fashionable gowns she had left behind. Her father, Marshal Thomas Raines, sat hunched over his desk, his breathing a shallow, ragged sound in the quiet room. He was a formidable man, even in sickness. His reputation as a just but unyielding lawman was legendary across the territory. But a persistent inflammation of the lungs had stolen his strength, leaving his face gaunt and his eyes, once as sharp as a hawk's, clouded with pain and frustration. He watched his daughter, his expression a mixture of pride and profound regret. "You should not have come back. Lydia," he rasped, the words punctuated by a dry cough. It was a familiar refrain, a battle they had fought and refought since her arrival. "And who would ensure you actually take your medicine?" "Father," she replied, her tone light but firm. She set the glass before him. Dr. Miller was very clear, every 4 hours. Thomas grumbled but took the glass, his hand trembling slightly. "This town is no place for you. It is full of shadows." "I am not afraid of shadows," she said softly, her gaze drifting to the window. The snow was falling a little thicker now, each flake a tiny speck of purity in a world that felt anything but. She had come home to care for him, yes, but she had also come home to find something she could not name, a sense of belonging that the polished society of the East could never offer. She loved this harsh, unforgiving land, its raw beauty and the fierce independence of its people. She was her father's daughter, after all, and justice, she believed, was not just about laws and punishment, but about understanding the human heart. Later that evening, the westbound train from Tucson was due. Lydia was expecting a package from a Boston bookshop, a small luxury that connected her to the world she had left. As the sky deepened to a bruised purple, she bundled herself in a heavy cloak and walked the short distance to the depot, the cold air stinging her cheeks. The platform was nearly deserted, just a lone baggage handler and the station master stamping his feet against the chill. The distant whistle of the locomotive was a mournful cry in the vast, silent landscape. Caleb was on his way out of town when he heard it. It was not the train's whistle, but a sound that sent a jolt of ice through his veins, a sound more familiar than his own name, a volley of gunshots. It came from the direction of the tracks, a mile or so out of town where the land dipped into a shallow canyon. He reined dust in, every muscle in his body tense. His first instinct, the one honed by years of survival, was to turn and ride in the opposite direction. It was not his fight. It was not his business. He was a rancher now, a man of peace. But then he heard a scream, high and thin, a thread of pure terror slicing through the cacophony. It was a woman's scream. He cursed, a low guttural sound. The part of him he had tried so hard to bury, the part that had once lived by a harsh code of its own, clawed its way to the surface. He could not just ride away. He could not. He nudged dust into a gallop, the horse's powerful legs eating up the frozen ground, carrying him toward the very trouble he had spent 5 years avoiding. He crested a small rise and saw the scene laid out below him. The train was stopped, steam hissing from its great iron engine. Masked figures on horseback swarmed around the baggage car, their rifles barking fire into the night. He recognized their methods instantly, the brutal efficiency, the coordinated chaos, the red spurs. His gut twisted. It was as if his past had galloped out of the darkness to mock him. He dismounted, keeping to the shadows of the rocks, his movements fluid and silent. He was not looking for a fight with the whole gang. That was suicide. He was looking for the source of the scream. He saw her then, a woman in a dark cloak, being dragged from a passenger car by one of the outlaws. She was fighting, twisting in his grip, a small, fierce figure against a backdrop of violence. Caleb did not think. He acted. He circled around, using the noise and confusion as cover. He came up behind the man, who was too focused on subduing his captive to notice the approaching threat. Caleb's arm snaked around the man's throat, cutting off his air. The man struggled, his hands flying up to claw at the arm that held him. But Caleb's grip was like iron. He squeezed, a cold, detached precision guiding his actions, until the man went limp. He let the body fall to the ground and turned to the woman. "Come with me, now," he said, his voice a low command. Lydia could only stare for a moment, her heart hammering against her ribs. The face of her rescuer was obscured by the low brim of his hat and the deep shadows of the canyon. All she saw was a tall silhouette, a presence that radiated a dangerous calm amidst the mayhem. She did not hesitate. She took the hand he offered, his grip firm and calloused, and let him lead her away from the train, melting into the darkness as another round of gunfire erupted behind them. He moved with a speed and certainty that was breathtaking. He led her to his horse, lifted her into the saddle as if she weighed nothing, and swung up behind her. He wrapped one arm around her waist to hold her steady, and with the other, he guided the horse away from the canyon, not back toward the town, but deeper into the wilderness. "Where are you taking me?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Away from them," he answered, his voice a low rumble near her ear. "We will circle back to town. They will expect us to take the direct route." His logic was sound, born of a knowledge she did not possess. She fell silent, trusting this stranger in a way she could not explain. She could feel the solid warmth of his body against her back, a shield against the cold and the fear. They rode in silence for what felt like an eternity. The only sounds, the rhythmic drumming of hooves and the whisper of the wind. He had draped a rough woolen blanket from his saddle roll around her shoulders, and its simple warmth was a comfort beyond measure. When the lights of Redemption Creek finally appeared, small and wavering in the distance, a collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through the town's few deputies who had gathered in a nervous posse at the edge of town. They saw the single horse approaching with 2 riders and raised their rifles. "Hold your fire," a voice called out. It was the station master. That might be one of the passengers. As Caleb rode into the dim light cast by the marshal's office, the deputies surrounded him, their faces grim. He brought dust to a halt and gently helped Lydia down. The moment her feet touched the ground, she was engulfed by the station master, his face pale with worry. "Miss Raines, thank heavens we heard the shots. We did not know what to do." At the mention of her name, Caleb froze. Raines, the marshal's daughter. Of all the people on that train, he had saved the one person who would guarantee him the most trouble. He saw the shift in the deputy's eyes as they looked from her to him. The suspicion was immediate, a poison seeping into the air. Deputy Miller, a young man with more bravado than sense, stepped forward, his pistol aimed squarely at Caleb's chest. "What is your business with the marshal's daughter? Monroe." "He saved me," Lydia said, her voice ringing with authority as she stepped between them. "There was a robbery. The Red Spurs. This man saved my life." The name of the gang hung in the air, thick and menacing. Another deputy, a grizzled older man named Peterson, narrowed his eyes at Caleb. "The Red Spurs. You say funny, you running into your old friends like that. Might convenient. I'd say." "I do not ride with them anymore," Caleb said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. He kept his hands away from his sides, in plain sight. "He fought one of them," Lydia insisted. "He got me away." "Or maybe he was the lookout," Miller countered, his finger tightening on the trigger. Maybe his job was to handle any passengers who got loose while the rest of them cleaned out the baggage car. The accusation was absurd, yet in the tense atmosphere, it found fertile ground. Caleb's past was a tangible thing, a weight that tipped the scales of justice against him before any facts could be heard. He looked from one hostile face to the next, a weary resignation settling over him. He had known this would happen. A man like him did not get a second chance in a town like this. Redemption was just a name on a map. The door to the marshal's office opened, and Thomas Raines stood silhouetted in the doorway, a shotgun held loosely in his hands. His sickness was forgotten, his eyes blazing with the cold fire of the law. He took in the scene his daughter, safe but shaken, and the man he knew only by reputation, a man who represented everything he had sworn to fight. "What is going on here?" the marshal demanded, his voice a low growl that cut through the deputy's chatter. "Father, this man, Caleb Monroe, he saved me," Lydia began, rushing to his side. Thomas ignored her, his gaze fixed on Caleb. He saw the way Caleb stood, the easy balance of a man comfortable with violence. He saw the scar on his wrist, peeking from beneath his cuff in the lantern light. He saw a shadow from the past, and his face hardened into a mask of stone. "Put him in a cell," the marshal ordered, his voice leaving no room for argument. "We will sort this out in the morning." "Father, you cannot," Lydia cried, grabbing his arm. "He is a hero." "He is a former member of the Red Spurs, and he was found with you at the scene of their latest crime," Thomas said, his voice grim. "In my book, that makes him a suspect. Lock him up." The deputies moved in, taking Caleb's gun and shoving him toward the jail cells. Caleb did not resist. He met Lydia's outraged, disbelieving gaze for a fleeting moment. In his own eyes, there was no anger, no surprise, only a profound and bottomless weariness. It was the look of a man who had expected nothing less. The heavy iron door clanged shut behind him, the sound echoing in the cold, snowy night. The meeting between the cowboy and the marshal's daughter had begun, not with gratitude, but with the cold, hard bars of a jail cell between them. The morning after the robbery dawned cold and unforgiving. A pale sun did little to warm the frigid air that seeped through the cracks of the jailhouse. Caleb sat on the edge of the narrow cot, the silence of the cell a familiar companion. He had not slept. He had simply waited, a statue carved from patience and cynicism. He expected no justice here, only the predictable turning of the gears of prejudice. Lydia had argued with her father until she was hoarse, her voice a passionate storm against his wall of implacable conviction. She recounted every detail of her rescue, her words painting a picture not of a criminal accomplice, but of a quiet, decisive protector. Her testimony, coming from the marshal's own daughter, was the only thing that kept Caleb from being held indefinitely. It was an inconvenient truth her father could not easily dismiss. Shortly after noon, Deputy Peterson unlocked the cell door with a grating squeal of metal. He tossed Caleb's gun belt onto the cot. "The marshal says you are free to go," he said, his tone suggesting it was a grave error in judgment. "But I would watch my step if I were you. Monroe, we will be watching." Caleb said nothing. He strapped on his belt, the weight of the Colt revolver a heavy, unwelcome memory against his hip. He walked out of the marshal's office without a backward glance, stepping into the weak sunlight. The town of Redemption Creek seemed to hold its breath as he passed. Faces appeared in windows. Conversations on the boardwalk died to whispers, and eyes followed him with a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. He was a story they would tell their children, a living piece of the violent folklore of the West. He ignored them all, his focus on the livery stable where dust was waiting. His plan was simple: get his horse, ride back to his ranch, and fortify the walls of his solitude. Lydia watched him go from the office window, a knot of guilt tightening in her stomach. She had secured his freedom, but she had also exposed him to the town's collective scorn. It felt like a poor repayment for the gift of her life. She turned to face her father, who was now seated heavily in his chair, a fit of coughing shaking his thin frame. "You let him go," she said, her voice quiet. "There was no evidence to hold him." Thomas Raines rasped, wiping his mouth with a handkerchief. "But do not mistake procedure for belief. Lydia, I know his kind." "You know his reputation," she corrected gently. "You do not know the man." The marshal's eyes, weary from his illness, flashed with their old, hard light. He looked at his daughter, at the earnest conviction in her face, and his heart ached with a protective fear. "Listen to me. Men like Caleb Monroe are born from violence. They live by it and they die by it. It is the only language they truly understand. They may change their clothes, they may learn to hold their tongue, but the wolf is always there, just beneath the skin. People like him only know guns and sin. He may have done a decent thing last night, but a single drop of rain does not signal the end of a drought. Stay away from him. That is an order not from your father, but from the marshal of this town." His words were meant to be a warning, a shield to place around her, but to Lydia, they sounded like a judgment passed without a trial. A door slammed shut on the very idea of redemption in a town that bore its name. She felt a profound sense of debt to Caleb, a debt her father's prejudice refused to acknowledge. Caleb's plans to retreat were complicated when he reached his small, isolated ranch. During his night in jail, the bitter wind had found a weakness in the roof of his modest cabin, tearing a section of it away. A fine layer of snow covered a portion of the floor, and the supplies he had purchased just 2 days before were exposed to the elements. He surveyed the damage with a stoic calm, but inside, a cold frustration took hold. The repairs would require lumber and time, both of which required money he did not have. The pelts he had meant to trade were still in his saddlebags, but they would not be enough. His pride warred with his practicality. He could leave, ride on to another territory and start again. But he had started again here. This small piece of land, this quiet life, was the closest thing to peace he had ever known. Abandoning it felt like a surrender to the very past he was trying to outrun. He made his decision. He would have to work. He mended the roof as best he could with salvaged planks and rode back into the town he had just been so eager to leave. The dusty lantern was the pulsing, whiskey-soaked heart of Redemption Creek. It was a place of loud talk and easy credit, run by a man named Silas Croft, who valued a strong back and a quiet mouth more than a man's history. Caleb found him behind the bar, polishing a glass until it shone. "I am looking for work," Caleb said, his voice low and even. Silas paused, his eyes appraising Caleb over the rim of the glass. He had heard the stories. Of course, everyone had. He also saw a man who looked like he could handle himself and would not shy away from the less savory tasks of running a saloon. "Can you chop wood, haul barrels, muck out the storeroom? Can you deal with drunks without starting a gunfight?" Silas asked, his voice gravelly. "I can," Caleb replied. "Good. The pay is $2 a day, plus one meal. You start now." And so, Caleb Monroe, the former gunslinger, became a handyman at the local saloon. He spent his days in the background, a silent, efficient presence. He stacked firewood, repaired rickety chairs, and carried heavy crates of whiskey from the storeroom. He wore a pair of old, tattered leather gloves, the fingers worn through, the palms stained with the grime of honest labor. The gloves protected his hands, but they also hid them, as if he were ashamed of what they had once done. He could feel the eyes of the patrons on him, their whispers following him like his own shadow. Each suspicious glance was a confirmation of his deepest fear that he would forever be judged not by the man he was trying to become, but by the man he had been. He was a ghost at the feast, present in body but an outcast in spirit, his past an unpayable debt. A few days later, Lydia walked into the dusty lantern. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer, sawdust, and unwashed bodies. A card game was in full swing in one corner, and a few prospectors were hunched over the bar, nursing their drinks. Her father, stubbornly refusing to rest, had insisted on coming in for a meal, and she was there to bring him his medication and see him home. She spotted him at a small table, and as she approached, her eyes caught a figure by the back wall, methodically sweeping the floor. It was Caleb. He looked different out of the shadows of the canyon. The harsh saloon light carved planes and angles into his face, revealing a weariness around his eyes that she had not seen before. He moved with an economy of motion, his focus entirely on his task. He had not seen her. She gave the medicine to her father, who grumbled about her fussing over him in public. And then, on an impulse she did not fully understand, she walked over to Caleb. "Mr. Monroe," she said. He stopped sweeping and looked up. His eyes, a startlingly clear shade of gray, met hers. They held a guarded, watchful quality, the look of a man who expected trouble from every direction. "Miss Raines," he acknowledged, his voice a low murmur. "I did not have a chance to properly thank you," she said, her hands clasped in front of her. A small, simple silver cross was suspended on a delicate chain around her neck, and it caught the lamplight, a tiny spark of brightness in the dim room. "You saved my life." A corner of his mouth twitched, a faint, humorless smile. "And you saved me from enjoying your father's hospitality for another night. I suppose that makes us even." His sarcasm was a shield, and she recognized it as such. She would not be so easily deterred. "My father is a cautious man." "That is a polite word for it," Caleb said, leaning on the broom. "He sees a snake. He does not wait to see if it will bite. He just stomps on its head." "And are you a snake, Mr. Monroe?" she asked, her gaze direct, unwavering. He was silent for a long moment. his gray eyes searching her face. He saw no judgment there, no fear, only a genuine, unsettling curiosity. It had been a long time since anyone had looked at him as if he were simply a man, and not a story. "I have been," he admitted, his voice so low she had to strain to hear it over the noise of the saloon. "But I am trying to shed that skin." "The people in this town do not make that easy, do they?" she said, her voice full of a sudden, fierce empathy. He gave a short, dry laugh. "Folks out here prefer their stories simple. Good men and bad men, white hats and black hats. There is not much room for anything in between." He looked down at his gloved hands, at the worn, scarred leather. They see these hands and they only remember the gun, not the broom. "I see the broom," she said softly. His gaze snapped back to hers, a flicker of surprise in their depths. The wall of his cynicism seemed to crack, just for a moment, revealing a glimpse of the man beneath, a man who was tired of running, tired of fighting, tired of being the villain in everyone else's story. The air between them thickened, charged with unspoken words. The loud, boisterous saloon seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the two of them in a small bubble of quiet understanding. Marshal Raines's voice, sharp and commanding, broke the spell. "Lydia, it is time to go." She looked away from Caleb. Her cheeks flushed. "I should go." She hesitated, then added, "Thank you again, for everything." She turned and walked back to her father, acutely aware of Caleb's eyes on her back. As she helped the marshal to his feet, she glanced back one last time. Caleb had resumed his sweeping, his movements once again mechanical, his face an impassive mask. But she had seen behind the mask, and what she had seen was not the cold-blooded outlaw of her father's warnings, but a man wrestling with his own shadow, a man who, perhaps, deserved a second chance. And as she held the silver cross at her throat, a symbol of her faith, she felt a new conviction take root in her heart. She believed he did. In a town as small and tightly wound as Redemption Creek, a secret had the lifespan of a snowflake on a hot stove. The quiet conversation between the marshal's daughter and the saloon's brooding handyman was fuel enough for a fire of speculation that spread with astonishing speed. It began with a raised eyebrow from a woman buying flour at the general store, transformed into a knowing nod between two ranchers on the boardwalk, and finally blossomed into a full-fledged, sordid tale over cheap whiskey in the very saloon where it had begun. The story twisted with each telling, its edges sharpened by malice and boredom. Soon, the accepted truth was that Lydia Raines, the educated, respectable daughter of the territory's most unbending lawman, was keeping company with a known killer, a man with the shadow of the gallows clinging to him. Lydia felt the change in the town's atmosphere almost immediately. The polite greetings she was accustomed to became either curt and dismissive or laced with a new, unwelcome familiarity. Women who had once inquired after her father's health now offered tight, pitying smiles and hurried away. The men were worse. Their gazes lingered too long, their expressions a crude mixture of derision and appraisal. They looked at her as if her brief, public conversation with Caleb Monroe had stripped away her respectability, marking her as tainted, accessible. The whispers followed her like a cloud of biting flies, and for the first time in her life, she felt like an outsider in her own home. The injustice of it all coiled in her gut, a hot, angry thing. They had condemned a man for a crime he had not committed, and now they were condemning her for simply showing him a moment of human decency. A few days before Christmas, a heavy snow began to fall, blanketing the town in a thick layer of white and further isolating it from the outside world. Lydia needed to collect a parcel from the stagecoach office, a collection of medical texts she had ordered for Dr. Miller, bundled in her heavy cloak. She stepped out into the swirling snow, the world transformed into a silent, monochrome landscape. The dusty lantern was the only beacon of warmth and light on the main street, its windows glowing with a hazy, inviting yellow. As she passed, the door swung open, spilling a wave of raucous laughter and accordion music into the quiet street. A group of men stumbled out, their arms slung around each other, their faces flushed with drink. She recognized one of them immediately. Jedediah Jed Stone, a ranch hand from a spread south of town, was a man whose arrogance was matched only by his cruelty. He had a reputation for a quick temper and heavy hands. He saw her, and a slow, malicious grin spread across his face. He blocked her path, his large frame an intimidating obstacle on the narrow boardwalk. "Well, look what we have here," he slurred, his breath a foul cloud of whiskey in the cold air. "If it is not the little Marshal. You looking for your fella? Miss Raines, the quiet one, heard you have got a taste for the dangerous types." His companions snickered, their eyes glittering with drunken amusement. Lydia stood her ground, her chin held high, though her heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Excuse me, Mr. Stone, I am on an errand." "An errand," Jed mocked. Taking a step closer, the smell of him was overwhelming. "Is that what they are calling it these days? I hear Monroe is good with his hands. Maybe you could show me what it is you see in a man like that." He reached out, his hand grasping for her arm. Before his fingers could touch her sleeve, a hand shot out from the doorway of the saloon and clamped down on Jed's wrist like a steel trap. It was Caleb. He had been on his way out, his day's work done. When he had seen the confrontation, every instinct had screamed at him to keep walking, to turn away, to not get involved. But he could not. He saw the flicker of fear in Lydia's eyes, and it was a spark that lit a fuse inside him. "Let her go," Caleb said. His voice was unnervingly calm, a low, quiet rumble that was more menacing than any shout. Jed tried to wrench his arm free, but Caleb's grip was unbreakable. A look of pained surprise flashed across the drunk's face, quickly replaced by a surge of belligerent fury. "This ain't none of your concern. Monroe, this is between me and the lady." "You are mistaken," Caleb said, his gray eyes as cold and hard as river stones. "This is between you and me now," I said. "Let her go." With a sharp twist, he forced Jed's hand away from Lydia. Jed stumbled back, shaking his wrist, his face contorted with rage. "You think you are better than us, you gunslick trash hiding behind a broom and the Marshal's daughter!" He lunged at Caleb, his fists flailing wildly. What happened next was a blur of brutal efficiency. It was not a fight, it was a dismantling. Caleb did not waste a single motion. He sidestepped Jed's clumsy charge, his body moving with a fluid grace that was terrifying to behold. He struck once, a hard, precise blow to Jed's jaw that made a sickening crack. He followed it with another to the man's stomach, doubling him over. As Jed gasped for air, Caleb shoved him backward. The drunken ranch hand crashed through the saloon's swinging doors, landing in a heap on the sawdust-covered floor inside. Unconscious, his two companions, their bravado evaporating in the face of such swift, controlled violence, stared at Caleb with wide, terrified eyes. Caleb turned his cold gaze on them. He did not say a word. He did not have to. They scrambled to help their fallen friend, dragging him deeper into the saloon and away from the silent, dangerous man on the boardwalk. The street was suddenly quiet again, the only sound the soft hiss of the falling snow. Caleb stood for a moment, his breathing even, his fists still clenched at his sides. He looked at Lydia, and the coldness in his eyes was replaced by a deep, profound regret. This was exactly what he had wanted to avoid. He had just proven every one of his detractors right. He was, and always would be, a man of violence. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough. "I am fine," she breathed, her hand pressed to her chest as if to still her racing heart. "Thank you." Before either of them could say another word, the door to the Marshal's office flew open. Thomas Raines stood there, a coat thrown hastily over his nightshirt, his face a thunderous mask of fury. He had heard the commotion from his office, and his worst fears had been realized. He saw the scene before him, his daughter, pale and shaken, and Caleb Monroe, standing in the street like a predator over its kill. "I knew it," the Marshal seethed, his voice shaking with a mixture of rage and the weakness from his illness. I knew you were trouble. I will not have this kind of filth brawling in my streets and terrorizing my daughter." "Father, it was not his fault," Lydia pleaded, rushing to his side. "Those men, they were accosting me. He was protecting me." "Protecting you?" Thomas scoffed, his eyes blazing. "He is a wild animal. Lydia, this is what they do. They solve their problems with their fists and their guns. I want him out of this town. I want him gone by sunrise." He pointed a trembling finger at Caleb. "You hear me? Monroe. You get your things and you ride out. If I see your face in Redemption Creek tomorrow, I will lock you up and throw away the key." Caleb met the marshal's furious gaze without flinching. He saw no point in arguing, no reason to defend himself. The verdict had been passed long ago. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He then looked at Lydia, his expression unreadable, and turned and walked away, disappearing into the swirling snow. The argument that followed in the marshal's office was the most terrible of Lydia's life. She confronted her father with a passion that stunned them both. "You are a hypocrite," she cried, her voice trembling with emotion. "You wear a star that is supposed to represent justice, but you are blind to it. You see only what you want to see, a past that he cannot change. That man has done nothing but good since I have known him. He saved my life. He protected me tonight. Not all men who carry guns are bad, Father, and not all men who wear a star are right." Her words struck him like a physical blow. He sank into his chair, his anger deflating, leaving behind a weary, frightened old man. "You do not understand the world, Lydia," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "I am trying to protect you from it." "You are trying to protect me from the one man in this town who has shown me any true decency," she retorted, tears of frustration streaming down her face. She turned and fled to her small room, the sound of her own sobs echoing in the tense silence of the office. That night, Caleb gathered his meager possessions from the room he rented behind the saloon. He moved with a quiet resignation, his heart a heavy, cold stone in his chest. He had truly tried to build a different life, but the past was a relentless hunter, and it had finally caught up to him. The marshal was right about one thing for Lydia's sake. He had to leave. His presence here would only bring her more trouble, more scorn. He could not protect her if he was the source of her danger. He saddled dust in the dead of night, the stable empty and silent. The snow had stopped falling, and a sliver of moon cast a pale, ethereal light over the white landscape. As he was about to mount, his hand brushed against the woolen blanket still tied to his saddle roll. It was the same one he had wrapped around Lydia's shoulders on the night of the train robbery. On impulse, he untied it. It was rough and a little worn, but it was clean and warm. It was the only thing of value he truly possessed. He walked through the sleeping town, his boots making no sound in the deep snow. He stopped in front of the marshal's office. He did not knock. He simply folded the blanket neatly and tucked it into the handle of the door. A silent, anonymous offering. It was a thank you, and it was a goodbye. He turned without a second glance and walked back to his horse, a solitary figure moving through the cold, silent world. He rode out of Redemption Creek, heading north, with no destination in mind, just a need to put the town and the woman he was leaving behind as far away as possible. The next morning, when Lydia emerged from her room, her eyes red and swollen, she found the woolen blanket. She knew instantly who it was from. She pulled it from the door handle, its rough texture a comforting weight in her hands. She pressed it to her face, breathing in the faint, clean scent of leather and the cold night air. It was a tangible piece of him, a reminder of his quiet strength and his unexpected gentleness. She clutched the blanket to her chest, a fresh wave of sorrow washing over her. She folded it carefully and took it to her room, a secret keepsake of the man her father had driven away. She did not know that his departure was not an end, but merely a pause. She did not know that in just a few short days, the fate of the entire town would rest on whether she could find him again. Caleb Monroe rode north with no destination, letting the cold seep into him until it felt like a part of his own bones. He made a lonely camp each night. The fire, a small circle of defiance against a vast, indifferent wilderness of snow and rock. He was running again. Not from the law, but from the ghost of a possibility. The faint, flickering hope he had seen in Lydia Raines's eyes. It was that hope. More than any lawman's accusation. That terrified him. Hope was a fool's currency in a world that had taught him to value only the cold, hard certainty of survival. He told himself he was glad to be gone, that the weight of the town's judgment had been a yoke he was better off without. But in the dead of night, when the fire burned low and the silence was absolute, her face would rise in his mind's eye, and the lie would taste like ash in his mouth. Back in Redemption Creek, a tense and miserable quiet had settled between Lydia and her father. They moved around each other in the small office, their conversations limited to the bare necessities of his care. The woolen blanket Caleb had left was hidden away in her trunk, a secret source of warmth and sorrow. Her father's cough had worsened, each ragged breath a testament to the toll his stubborn pride was taking on his failing body. He had won the battle, driven the threat away, but the victory felt hollow and cold to them both. The world intruded upon their private war 2 days before Christmas Eve, arriving as a frantic series of clicks from the telegraph office. A special train was coming from El Paso, carrying a year-end gold shipment for the territorial banks. It was a prize of unimaginable value. The message also carried a chilling addendum. A scattered group of riders, matching the description of the red spurs, had been seen shadowing the rail line. They were moving with a purpose, and their path was aimed directly at the vulnerable stretch of track that ran through the canyons near Redemption Creek. The news spread through the town like a contagion of fear. The Red Spurs were not common bandits. They were predators, known for their ruthlessness and military precision. The memory of the last attack was still fresh and raw. For Marshal Thomas Raines, the message was a call to arms that his body was ill-equipped to answer. But the spirit, the unbending iron will of the lawmen, refused to yield. He pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the dizzy spell that made the room swim. "Deputy Peterson," he rasped, his voice a ghost of its former authority. "Get me a posse. Every man who can shoot straight. We ride out in 1 hour." Lydia watched him, her heart clenching with terror. "Father, you cannot," she pleaded, rushing to his side. "You are not well. Let the deputies handle this." "The deputies are good men, but they are not enough for this," he said, shrugging off her hand. He began checking the cylinders of his peacemaker, his movement slow but deliberate. "This is my town, my responsibility. I will not hide behind my sickness while men like that ride free." Peterson and a handful of other men began to gather in the street, their faces grim, checking rifles and cinching saddles. They were shopkeepers and ranchers, brave men but not gunfighters. Lydia looked at their determined, anxious faces and felt a wave of cold dread. They were riding into a slaughter. They had no idea what they were up against. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the marrow, that only one man did. Only one man knew how the Red Spurs thought, how they moved, how they would strike not where you expected, but where you were weakest. Her father's order echoed in her mind, "Stay away from him." But a more powerful imperative took its place: "Save your father." In that moment, her loyalty to the man she loved warred with her faith in the man she respected, and her faith won. She slipped out the back of the office and ran to the livery stable. A young boy named Samuel, who had always treated her with a shy kindness, was forking hay into a stall. "Samuel," she said, her voice low and urgent, "I need you to do something for me. It is more important than anything you have ever done." She pressed a few coins into his hand, closing his fingers around them. "I need you to find Caleb Monroe." The boy's eyes widened. "But Miss Raines, the Marshal?" "The Marshal will be dead if you do not go," she said, her voice sharp with desperation. "These men, the Red Spurs, they were his old gang. He will know what they are going to do. Please, Samuel, ride north. He cannot have gone far. Tell him Redemption Creek needs him. Tell him I need him." Samuel saw the desperate plea in her eyes, a sincerity that overrode his fear of the marshal. He nodded, saddled the fastest horse in the stable, and was gone in a cloud of kicked-up snow. A small, unlikely messenger on a mission to find a ghost. Caleb had found shelter in an old, abandoned line shack nestled in a high canyon, a place forgotten by the world. He was cleaning his revolver, the familiar, methodical process a balm to his restless mind. When he heard the frantic drumming of hooves, he was on his feet in an instant, his gun in his hand, moving to the side of the doorway, concealed by the shadows. He watched as the boy rode into the clearing, his horse lathered and breathing hard. Samuel slid from the saddle, his eyes scanning the area fearfully. "Mr. Monroe," he called out, his voice thin in the vast quiet. "Are you here? Miss Raines sent me." Caleb stepped out of the shadows, his gun still held loosely at his side. The boy flinched, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and terror. Samuel poured out the story of the gold train, the red spurs, and the marshal's ill-fated posse, his words tumbling over each other in his haste. Caleb listened, his face an impassive mask, but his gut twisted into a cold, hard knot. The red spurs, they were like a curse he could not shake. "So the marshal is riding into an ambush," Caleb stated, his voice flat. It was not a question. "Yes, sir," Samuel said, breathing heavily. "Miss Raines, she said you would know what to do. She said she needs you." That last part hit him like a physical blow. Not the town, not her father, her. He looked away, his gaze fixed on the distant, snow-covered peaks. It was a trap, in more ways than one. To go back was to ride into the very violence he had fled. To go back was to face the man who had exiled him. To go back was to risk everything, but to stay here, to let that posse ride to its doom, to let her father die and leave her alone. That was unthinkable. He was not a hero. He was not a man of honor. But the thought of Lydia, her face pale with worry, was a force more powerful than reason. He was not going back for honor, or for justice, or for the town of Redemption Creek. He was going back for her. He looked at the boy. "Get back to town. Stay off the main trail. Tell no one you saw me." He swung himself into Dust's saddle and urged the horse into a gallop, not north, but south, back toward the world he had tried so desperately to leave behind. The marshal and his posse had set up their position in a narrow pass where the train tracks cut through a wall of red rock. It was a natural choke point, and Thomas Raines had positioned his men on the low ground, behind a cluster of boulders near the tracks, confident he could repel a direct assault. It was a textbook strategy, and it was suicidally wrong. Caleb arrived on the ridge above the pass like a phantom, Dust's hooves making no sound in the deep snow. He surveyed the scene below, and a grim certainty settled over him. He knew this pass, and he knew the leader of the Red Spurs, a man named Silas Kane. Kane would never attack from the front. He would use the high ground. He would rain fire down on the posse from above, pinning them like rats in a barrel. Caleb scanned the opposite ridge and saw what he was looking for, the faint glint of sunlight on a rifle barrel, a flicker of movement among the rocks. They were already in position. The train's whistle echoed in the distance, a mournful cry signaling its approach. It was the signal. A single shot rang out from the high ridge, and one of the posse members cried out, clutching his shoulder as he fell. And then the canyon erupted in a deafening roar of gunfire. Bullets ricocheted off the rocks around the posse, kicking up sprays of stone and snow. The lawmen were completely exposed, their return fire wild and ineffective as they could not get a clear shot at the attackers hidden above them. Marshal Raines was on one knee, firing his rifle at the unseen enemy, his face a mask of grim determination. He was a perfect target. Caleb saw one of the outlaws on the far ridge rise from behind a rock, taking careful aim at the marshal's exposed back. There was no time to think. Caleb raised his own rifle, aimed, and fired. The outlaw jerked and fell backward, his shot going wide. The marshal spun around, his eyes searching for the source of the shot that had saved him. He saw Caleb on the ridge above, a solitary figure against the gray sky. For a moment, their eyes met across the chaotic battlefield, a silent exchange of shock and disbelief. Caleb did not wait for thanks. He spurred dust down the steep, treacherous slope, firing as he went, creating a second front that the red spurs had not anticipated. His sudden aggressive attack threw them into confusion. They had been focused on the fish in the barrel below. They were not prepared for a wolf at their backs. A bullet tore through the sleeve of Caleb's coat, a hot, searing line of pain along his arm. But he ignored it. He was a whirlwind of controlled violence, his movements precise, his shots finding their mark. He was no longer a handyman with a broom. He was the man he used to be, and it was a terrifyingly perfect fit. His charge broke their advantage. Seeing their leader fall and now under fire from two directions, the remaining red spurs wavered. When the train's whistle sounded again, much closer this time, they broke and fled, melting back into the rocks. The sudden silence was as shocking as the noise had been. It was broken only by the groans of the wounded and the approaching chuff of the steam engine. The posse members slowly rose from behind their cover, their faces a mixture of relief and utter bewilderment. They stared up at Caleb, who had dismounted and was now leaning against a rock, his face pale, a dark stain spreading on his sleeve. Marshal Raines walked slowly toward him, his shotgun held loosely in his hand. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze falling on Caleb's wounded arm, then rising to meet his eyes. The arrogance, the certainty, was gone from the marshal's face, replaced by a complex emotion Caleb could not name. It was a look of grudging respect, of profound confusion, of a man whose entire world had just been turned upside down. "You came back," the marshal said, his voice a low, rough whisper. "She sent for me," Caleb replied simply. The train, its gold safe, chugged slowly past them, a testament to their victory. As the posse began to tend to their wounded, a new, thicker snow began to fall, the flakes large and soft, blanketing the scene of violence in a fresh layer of white. It fell on the living and the dead, on the lawman and the outlaw who had saved them. As they began the slow ride back to town, the first hesitant lights of Christmas began to flicker in the windows of Redemption Creek. Small, fragile sparks of hope against a sky that was the color of lead. And for the first time, the people of the town looked at Caleb Monroe not as a shadow, but as a man. The return of the posse was a strange and subdued affair. They rode back into Redemption Creek not as triumphant heroes, but as chastened survivors, bringing their wounded and a story that defied easy explanation. The tale of Caleb Monroe's sudden appearance on the ridge, of his impossible charge against his former brethren, and of the marshal's life being saved by the very man he had exiled, became the town's new gospel. It was a story told in hushed, wondering tones at the general store, a confusing sermon delivered over fences and in the pews of the small church. The fear that had once defined Caleb's presence had been replaced by something far more complicated, a wary, bewildered gratitude. Christmas Eve arrived on the heels of this new understanding, the air thick with falling snow and a feeling of fragile peace. The dusty lantern, for one night, shed its skin of desperation and became a sanctuary of community. Silas Croft, the proprietor, had hung boughs of pine over the bar, their sharp, clean scent mingling with the familiar aromas of wood smoke and whiskey. A large fire roared in the stone hearth, casting a warm, dancing light that softened the hard lines of the room and the harder lines on the faces of the men and women gathered there. The out-of-tune piano, manned by a prospector with more enthusiasm than talent, played a medley of cheerful carols that were occasionally recognizable. Lydia Raines moved through the warm, crowded room like a beacon. She had come with a large basket filled with small, hand-stitched dolls for the girls and carved wooden horses for the boys, along with a tray of gingerbread cookies that filled the air with the sweet scent of cinnamon and molasses. She was the town's angel tonight, her smile a genuine comfort, her presence a promise that despite the harshness of their lives, there were still moments of grace to be found. The children flocked to her, their faces alight with a joy that was pure and infectious. In a dark, quiet corner, far from the fire's glow, Caleb Monroe sat alone at a small table. He nursed a single glass of whiskey, the amber liquid untouched. His left arm was in a clean white sling, a stark contrast to his dark, worn clothes. Dr. Miller had cleaned and stitched the wound, declaring it a clean shot that would heal with time, but it ached with a dull, persistent throb. It was not the pain that kept him in the shadows, but the suffocating weight of the town's newfound respect. The averted eyes and fearful whispers had been a kind of armor. This new deference, the clumsy nods of thanks from men who had once looked at him with contempt, left him feeling exposed and raw. He was a fraud, a wolf being lauded for saving a few sheep from a larger pack. He did not belong in the warmth of their celebration. He was a creature of the cold, of the dark spaces between the moments of peace. His gaze was fixed on Lydia. He watched the way the candlelight caught the honeyed strands of her hair, the way her face lit up when a small child hugged her legs. She was a different species, a being of light and goodness that made the shadows inside him feel darker and deeper. Every laugh, every gentle touch she bestowed was a fresh reminder of the unbridgeable chasm that separated their worlds. He had come back for her, but now that he was here, he had never felt farther away. After the last cookie had been given and the last child had been sent off to bed with a whispered promise of St. Nicholas, Lydia's work was done. She stood for a moment by the fire, her duties fulfilled, and her gaze swept the room until it found him, a solitary silhouette in the corner. A quiet resolve settled over her. She had sent for him, brought him back into this world of judgment and violence. She would not leave him to face it alone. She crossed the room, her steps sure and steady. A path seemed to open for her, conversations faltering as people watched her go. They saw her destination, and a collective, unspoken question hung in the air. She stopped in front of his table, the warm light from the main room at her back, casting her in a soft, glowing outline. Caleb looked up, his gray eyes guarded, expecting a dismissal, a polite but firm request for him to leave and not spoil their fragile festivity. Instead, she smiled, a small, gentle curve of her lips that seemed to reach the weariness in his soul. "You do not believe in Christmas, do you?" she asked, her voice a quiet melody that was somehow clear above the noise of the saloon. It was not an accusation, but a simple, kind observation. He was silent for a long moment, caught off guard by the directness and the warmth of her question. He had expected pity or fear, not this easy, intimate inquiry. A lifetime of cynical replies and hard-bitten truths rose to his lips, but they died there, strangled by the sincerity in her eyes. He felt a tremor start deep inside him, a crack in the ice that had encased his heart for so long. A reckless, terrifying hope pushed its way through. He gave her a ghost of a smile, a crooked, uncertain thing. "Only if you will be my Christmas date," he said. The words were a low murmur, half a joke to cushion the fall, half a prayer that was raw with a vulnerability he had not allowed himself to feel in years. A profound silence fell over the dusty lantern. The boisterous laughter died. The card players froze with their hands hovering over the table, and even the piano player's fingers stilled over the keys. Every eye in the room was on them, on the quiet man in the corner and the Marshal's daughter. In that single, suspended moment, 100 different stories and prejudices hung in the balance. Lydia's smile widened, a radiant, beautiful thing that lit up her whole face. She did not answer with words. Instead, she held out her hand. It was Silas Croft, the saloon owner, who broke the spell. He gave a sharp, decisive nod to the piano player. The man, startled, began to play again, not a carol this time, but a slow, simple waltz. The notes hesitant at first, then gaining confidence as they filled the silent room. Caleb looked at her outstretched hand as if it were a strange and foreign object. Then, slowly, he placed his own hand in hers. His was rough, calloused, the knuckles scarred. Hers was warm and soft. The contrast was a jolt, a connection of two different worlds. He stood, his tall frame unfolding from the shadows. She led him to the small, clear space in the center of the floor, and they began to dance. It was not a graceful or practiced affair. It was a simple, shuffling movement, a slow turning in the warm, flickering light. He held her carefully, his injured arm making his movement stiff and awkward. She did not seem to notice. She rested her hand on his good shoulder, her gaze locked with his. The noisy, crowded saloon faded away, the faces of the onlookers blurring into a distant backdrop. There was only the music, the warmth of the fire, and the startling, profound connection in their eyes. He saw no judgment in her gaze, no fear, only a deep and unwavering belief that he was more than the sum of his past. And she saw, behind the hardened exterior and the weary eyes, a flicker of the good man he so desperately wanted to be. It was a dance of unspoken promises, of tentative hopes, a quiet, intimate conversation in a language of its own. Outside, in the cold, biting wind, Marshal Thomas Rain stood in the shadows across the street. He had not been able to stay away. He had come to ensure his daughter was safe, to watch over her from a distance. He stood in the falling snow, a ghost at the feast, and looked through the large saloon window. He saw the scene inside, the warm light, the smiling faces, and then he saw his daughter, dancing in the arms of Caleb Monroe. He watched them, his face unreadable. He saw the way Caleb held her, a mixture of reverence and protection. He saw the genuine, unguarded happiness on Lydia's face, a happiness he realized with a painful pang that he had not seen in a very long time. He had built his life on a foundation of hard lines and absolute truths, right and wrong, black and white, law and chaos. But what he saw through that window did not fit into his rigid world. He saw a man who had committed sins, yet had acted with honor. He saw a man who had lived by the gun, yet had shown a quiet gentleness. A deep, shuddering sigh escaped his lips, a white plume in the frigid air. It was the sound of a lifetime of certainty beginning to crumble. Perhaps justice was not always found in a law book or at the end of a rope. Perhaps, sometimes, it was found in a second chance, in the quiet courage of a good woman, and in the redemption of a man who had forgotten how to believe in it himself. The weight on his shoulders, the weight of the star and the sins of the world, seemed to lighten just a fraction. He pulled his collar higher against the cold, turned, and walked slowly back to his empty office, leaving the couple to their dance. Two small figures turning in a circle of light, unaware of the silent blessing they had just received. The slow waltz ended, leaving a warm and lingering silence in its wake. The piano player, sensing the mood, shifted to a soft, gentle carol as people began to gather their coats, their faces softened by the spirit of the evening. The dance had changed something, not just between Caleb and Lydia, but in the room itself. A barrier had been broken, a quiet acceptance settling over the crowd like the fresh snow outside. Caleb walked with Lydia toward the door, the warmth of her hand still a phantom sensation in his own. He was acutely aware of the space between them, a space that now felt charged with a fragile, unspoken possibility. Outside, the snow was falling in thick, heavy flakes, muffling the world in a blanket of profound silence. The street was empty, the lights of the town soft and blurry through the swirling white. It was a scene of perfect Christmas card peace. "I should see you home," Caleb said, his voice low. "My father will be waiting up," she replied, a hint of a smile in her voice. "He will likely have a shotgun across his lap and a list of questions about my character." Caleb's own smile was a faint, fleeting thing. "I imagine he will." They stood for a moment in the deep quiet, the world seeming to hold its breath around them. It was a moment stolen from time, a pocket of peace that felt both infinite and impossibly fragile. The future was an unwritten page, and for the first time in a very long time, Caleb did not feel the need to run from it. The peace was shattered by the sudden, sharp sound of shattering glass, followed instantly by a guttural, terrifying whoosh. An unnatural, demonic orange light bloomed against the white snow, painting the side of the dusty lantern in flickering, hungry color. Another crash followed, and another window exploded inward, this time spewing a geyser of flame. The saloon, the town's warm, beating heart, had become an inferno. From the darkness at the edge of town, a volley of rifle shots erupted, the bullets thudding into the wooden walls of the buildings, not aimed to kill, but to terrorize, to keep anyone from interfering. The Red Spurs had returned. This was not a robbery. It was a message, an act of pure, nihilistic vengeance aimed squarely at the man who had betrayed them. Panic erupted. The few remaining patrons inside the saloon began to pour out, their faces masks of terror, their clothes smoking. But Lydia's eyes were wide with a different kind of horror. "The children," she breathed, her voice a choked whisper. A young mother, Mary, who worked occasionally at the saloon, had been in the back storeroom with her 2 small sons, bundling them up to leave just as the fire had broken out. Before Caleb could stop her, before he could even process what she was doing, Lydia turned and ran back toward the burning building. "Mary!" she screamed, her voice piercing the chaos. The boys. "Lydia! No!" Caleb roared, starting after her, but he was too late. She disappeared through the main doorway, a doorway that was now a gaping, fiery maw. For a frozen second, Caleb was no longer in Redemption Creek. He was back in a box canyon in the Chiricahua Mountains, 5 years ago. The smell of burning pine was the same. The searing, suffocating heat on his face was the same. He could hear the screams, not of strangers, but of Jake, a young man who had ridden with him, trapped in a burning cabin after a raid gone wrong. He remembered the roar of the fire, the feeling of utter helplessness as he was held back, the way the screams had eventually stopped. The memory was a brand on his soul, a failure that haunted his every waking moment. But this was not 5 years ago, and the person in the fire was not Jake, it was Lydia. The past and the present collided, and a cold, clarifying rage burned through him, hotter than any flame. He would not fail again. He ripped his wounded arm from its sling, a jolt of agony shooting through him, but he ignored it. He grabbed a heavy woolen horse blanket from a rail outside the saloon, dunked it in a half-frozen water trough, and wrapped it around his head and shoulders. He took a deep breath of the clean, cold air and plunged into the inferno. The heat was a physical blow, a solid wall that stole his breath and seared his lungs. The smoke was a thick, black, choking entity, reducing visibility to near zero. The roar of the fire was a deafening, all-consuming beast. He could hear the panicked screams of the trapped mother and the terrified cries of her children coming from the back. He stumbled forward, his eyes streaming, using the bar as a guide. He found Lydia near the back, trying to force open a jammed storeroom door, her face pale with effort and smudged with soot. "Get back," he yelled, shoving her behind him. He lowered his shoulder and slammed his full weight into the door. The wood groaned, but held. He hit it again, the impact jarring his entire body. On the third try, the frame splintered and the door burst open. Mary stumbled out, clutching her 2 small sons, their faces buried in her skirts, their small bodies trembling. "Aingo," Caleb commanded, pointing toward a side window. "Break the glass and get out now." As Mary scrambled to obey, a heavy timber from the ceiling, wreathed in flame, crashed down between Caleb and Lydia. Separating them, a wall of fire now stood between them. Lydia screamed, her voice tight with terror. He looked through the shimmering heat, through the dancing wall of orange and red. He saw her, her eyes wide with fear, and in that moment, nothing else in the world mattered. He was about to launch himself through the flames when a new sound cut through the roar, the sharp, authoritative crack of a shotgun. Marshal Thomas Raines stood in the main doorway, a wraith emerging from the smoke, his face grim, his eyes blazing with a fire of their own. His illness was forgotten, his body fueled by pure, paternal fury. He fired again at a dark shape moving in the street, one of the Spurs who had lingered to watch the chaos. "Get my daughter out of here," Monroe the Marshal roared, his voice a powerful command that defied the inferno. He began to move toward them, using the stock of his shotgun to beat back the encroaching flames, forging a path. Caleb did not hesitate. He vaulted over the bar, getting a running start, and leaped through the wall of fire. The heat was indescribable, a searing agony that licked at his clothes and skin. He landed on the other side, stumbling next to Lydia, beating at the embers that had caught on his shirt. He grabbed her arm. "Come on!" As they turned to follow the Marshal, a single, sharp rifle shot rang out from the darkness outside. It was different from the others, a sound of deadly intent. Thomas Raines cried out, a sharp, guttural sound, and staggered. A dark, ugly stain blossomed on the front of his coat. He fell to one knee, the shotgun clattering to the floor. Father Lydia screamed, a sound of pure anguish. She tried to run to him, but Caleb held her back, his grip like iron. "We have to go. The roof is coming down," he yelled, his voice raw. The Marshal looked up, his face ashen in the hellish light. He saw his daughter, safe for the moment with Caleb. He reached out a trembling hand, not to his daughter, but to the man he had once despised. Caleb instinctively grasped it. The Marshal's grip was surprisingly strong, a final, desperate surge of will. His eyes clear and focused, locked on Caleb's. "Protect her," the Marshal rasped, his voice a ragged whisper against the roar of the flames. Blood flecked his lips. She is my justice now." The strength went out of his hand. His eyes glazed over, and he slumped to the floor, a good man swallowed by the senseless violence he had fought his entire life to contain. A profound, animalistic cry of grief was torn from Lydia's throat. But there was no time for sorrow. With a groan of tortured wood, the main roof beam began to give way. Caleb threw Lydia over his good shoulder, his muscles screaming in protest, and ran. He burst out of the saloon's side door just as the entire roof collapsed inward with a deafening crash, sending a mushroom cloud of sparks and embers into the night sky. He stumbled a few yards into the street, the cold, clean air a shock after the suffocating heat. The world was a chaotic swirl of orange light and white snow. He gently lowered Lydia to her feet. She was sobbing, her body shaking uncontrollably, her eyes fixed on the burning pyre that had been the dusty lantern and was now her father's tomb. The strength that had carried him through the fire, the adrenaline and the rage, suddenly drained away, leaving behind a vast, empty weakness. The pain in his arm, the burns on his skin, the smoke in his lungs, and the immense weight of the Marshal's final words all crashed down on him at once. His legs gave out. He fell to his knees in the deep snow, pulling a devastated Lydia down with him, holding her tight as the ashes of their world fell around them. The days that followed were a blur of cold gray skies and the hollowed-out feeling of grief. Redemption Creek, a town that had only just found its festive heart, was now shrouded in mourning. The funeral for Marshal Thomas Raines was a simple, stark affair held on the small hill overlooking the town. Nearly everyone attended, their faces etched with a shared, somber respect. They stood in the biting wind, their dark coats a stark contrast to the endless white of the snow, as the preacher spoke of duty, justice, and a life given in service to the law. Lydia stood by the graveside, a still, silent figure in black. She felt a profound and terrible sense of being unmoored, as if the ground beneath her feet was no longer solid. The well-meaning condolences of the townspeople, the gentle squeeze of a hand, the murmured words of sorrow, all washed over her without truly touching her. She was an island of grief, surrounded by an ocean of sympathy she could not feel. Caleb stood at the back of the crowd, a silent sentinel. He had not approached her, had not offered any words. He knew that words were useless against a loss so vast. Instead, he simply watched, his presence a quiet, unwavering promise. The Marshal's last words were a brand on his soul, a sacred duty he had accepted in the heart of the inferno. Protect her. He watched for any sign of her faltering, ready to step forward. But she stood with a straight-backed fortitude that was the very essence of her father. After the funeral, the world seemed to lose its color. Lydia moved through the motions of living in the small office that had been her father's entire world. The smell of his pipe tobacco still clung to the curtains, a ghostly presence that brought a fresh wave of pain with every breath. The townspeople were relentlessly kind. The women brought covered dishes of food. Silas Croft delivered firewood, and Dr. Miller checked on her daily, his professional concern masking a deep, personal sorrow. But their kindness was a constant reminder of what she had lost. Every corner of the town, every familiar face, was a memory of her father. The charred, skeletal remains of the dusty lantern stood as a monument to the night her world had ended. She could not stay. The realization came to her one evening as she sat alone, staring into the flames of the small stove. This place was a graveyard, and she was its ghost. Her education in the East, which had once felt like a different lifetime, now seemed like a lifeline. She imagined the quiet, orderly streets of Boston, the hallowed, silent halls of the libraries, a world governed by books and reason, not by fire and bullets. She would sell her father's small house, pack her few belongings, and disappear back into the life she had left behind. She would run until the memory of the smoke and the sound of the gunshot were nothing more than a distant, faded echo. Caleb found her a few days later, pinning a notice to the board outside the Marshal's office, her hands trembling in the cold. It was a simple, handwritten announcement of the sale of her father's property. He knew, without her saying a word, what it meant. He waited until she was done and had turned to leave, her face pale and set. "You are leaving?" he said. It was not a question. She nodded, not meeting his eyes. "There is nothing for me here now?" "Where will you go?" he asked, his voice soft. "Back east, to Boston. I have friends there." He was silent for a long moment, the only sound the sigh of the wind through the bare cottonwood trees. He thought of his small, damaged cabin, of the vast, open sky, of the rugged, unforgiving land that was the only home he had ever known. Then he thought of her, alone on a train, carrying a grief that was too heavy for one person to bear. He thought of the Marshal's hand in his, the weight of a dying man's final wish. "I will go with you," he said. Lydia looked up, her eyes wide with surprise. "What?" "I will take you to Boston," he repeated, his voice even and steady. "I will see you settled and safe. It is a long journey to make alone." She stared at him, a storm of emotions crossing her face. The thought of his quiet, steady presence on that long, lonely journey was a comfort so profound it almost brought her to her knees. But she saw the sacrifice in his offer. He was a man of the West, a man carved from its rock and its dust. To put him in a crowded, noisy city like Boston would be like caging a hawk. "You cannot," she whispered. "Your life is here, your ranch." "My ranch is a pile of wood and a few acres of dust," he said with a dismissive shrug. "It can be rebuilt, or it can be forgotten. It does not matter. What mattered, what he could not say, was that any place without her in it now felt just as empty." Before she could answer, the sound of hammering echoed from down the street. It was a new sound in the quiet, grieving town, a sound of industry and life. Silas Croft, along with a dozen other men, was already at work on the skeleton of a new saloon, their movements energetic, determined. The fire had taken their place of gathering, but it had not taken their spirit. Lydia and Caleb watched them, a silent testament to the town's resilience. As they stood there, A small group of men broke away from the work and approached them. It was Silas, Deputy Peterson, and a few of the town's leading merchants. They stopped before Caleb, their expressions serious, their hats held respectfully in their hands. Silas Croft acted as the spokesman. "Monroe," he said, his voice direct. "The town council had a meeting this morning. We have all seen what has happened here. We have seen what you have done." Caleb's body tensed. He expected an accusation, a renewed suspicion, a final demand for him to leave. "We need a lawman," Silas continued, his gaze steady. "Someone who can keep the peace until a new marshal is appointed by the territory." The council voted. "We want you to be the new deputy." The offer hung in the cold, clear air, so unexpected, so utterly absurd, that Caleb could only stare at them in stunned silence. Him, a deputy. The irony was a bitter, metallic taste in his mouth. Deputy Peterson stepped forward, his face earnest. "I was there. Caleb, I saw what you did. I also saw the way the marshal looked at you. Right at the end, he trusted you. That is good enough for me. It is good enough for all of us." The words, meant to be an honor, felt like a hot brand against his skin. The marshal's trust was not a badge he could wear. It was a debt he could never repay. He looked at these men, at their hopeful, expectant faces, and he felt a suffocating wave of shame. They saw a hero, a savior. He saw a man with blood on his hands, a man whose past was a litany of sins that a single good deed could never wash away. He shook his head, a slow, decisive movement. "No," he said, his voice raspy. "You have got the wrong man. I am not what you think I am." He looked down at his own hands, seeing not the hands that had saved Lydia, but the hands that had once belonged to the red spurs. "I am not worthy of wearing a star. Any star." He turned to walk away, to flee from the honor he could not accept, from the faith he did not deserve. But Lydia's voice stopped him. "My father saw what I saw." Her words were quiet, but they carried an undeniable authority, a clear, ringing truth that cut through his self-doubt. He turned back to her slowly. She had stepped forward, her eyes clear and filled with a conviction that mirrored the one he had seen in the marshal in his final moments. She looked at him, and it felt as if she could see straight through to the frightened, running man he had always been. "For years, you have been running," she said, her voice soft but unwavering. "Running from your past, from your name, from your own shadow. But in these last few days, you stopped. You turned and you faced it. You faced them. You even faced him." She glanced at the men from the town, then back at Caleb. "My father was a hard man, and he did not give his trust easily. But at the end, he saw what I saw. A man who finally stopped running." Her words were a key, unlocking a prison inside him he had not even known he was in. He had been so focused on the sins of his past that he had been blind to the truth of his present. He had not run, he had come back. He had stood his ground. He had protected. The marshal's final words were not a burden, but a release. "She is my justice now." Justice was not about punishment or penance. It was about protecting the good in the world. A strange, unfamiliar feeling worked its way up from his chest. It was a lightness, a warmth that spread through him, chasing away the cold shadows of shame and regret. He looked at Lydia, at the fierce, unwavering belief in her eyes, and for the first time in his adult life, a genuine, unburdened smile touched his lips. It was not a smirk, not a grimace, but a real smile. One that reached his eyes and transformed his entire face, showing her and the watching world the man he was finally ready to become. 1 year later, the snow fell on a different town. It was still Redemption Creek, still a small, stubborn collection of buildings clinging to the Arizona landscape. But the soul of the place had changed. The snow this year did not seem like a foreign trespasser, but a soft, cleansing blanket. A familiar part of the season's gentle turning. It settled on the pitched roof of a new, small house at the edge of town. A house built with lumber from the surrounding hills and a quiet, determined hope. From the window of this house, Lydia Monroe watched the flakes drift down, each one a tiny, perfect star. She was hanging a wreath on the front door, a circle of fresh pine and red holly berries she had gathered herself. Her movements were no longer marked by the sharp, brittle edge of grief, but by a deep and settled contentment. The black mourning dress had been put away, replaced by a simple gown of deep blue wool that brought out the warmth in her eyes. The past year had been one of rebuilding, not just of buildings, but of lives. The dusty lantern stood again, resurrected from its own ashes, but it was a different place now. Silas Croft, with the help of the entire town, had built it back bigger and brighter, with large windows that let in the sun and a separate room in the back where families could eat and children could play without being underfoot of the prospectors and ranch hands. It was less a saloon now and more a town hall, a place of gathering and community. It was a symbol of their collective decision to build something better from the wreckage of the old. The sound of a baby's cry, a small, insistent sound, drew her back inside. She closed the door, the scent of pine clinging to her, and found Caleb walking the floor with a small, bundled infant in his arms. He held the baby with a gentleness that was still a source of quiet wonder to her, his large, scarred hands looking impossibly tender as they supported the tiny head. Caleb, who had once been the town's shadow, was now its deputy, and a father. He wore the simple tin star pinned to his vest not with pride or arrogance, but with a sense of quiet, solemn duty. It was a weight he had chosen to carry, and he carried it well. He looked up as Lydia entered, his face, which had once been a mask of guarded weariness, softening at the sight of her. "I believe young Thomas has an opinion about the cold," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. Lydia smiled and took the baby from him, settling the infant against her shoulder. "He has his grandfather's lungs. That is for sure," she said softly, her hand stroking the baby's fine, dark hair. They had named him Thomas, a tribute to the man whose legacy was not in the laws he had enforced, but in the love he had left behind. The town had not just accepted Caleb, they had embraced him. The initial awe had slowly given way to a steady, comfortable respect. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke a language everyone understood. He was fair, he was steady, and he possessed a deep, intuitive understanding of the fine line between justice and mercy. He had stopped a card game from turning bloody with a single, quiet sentence. He had tracked a lost child for 2 days through a blizzard and brought him home safe. He was no longer Caleb Monroe, the former Red Spur. He was Deputy Monroe, their deputy. He had finally found a home not on a piece of land, but in the trust of other people. Lydia had found her home here too. The thought of Boston, of a life of quiet academia, now seemed like a distant, colorless dream. Her life was here, in the heart of this wild, beautiful, and sometimes violent land. Her purpose was not in books, but in the community she was helping to build, in the family she was creating. She had not run from her grief. She had planted a new life in its soil. That evening, the whole town seemed to be celebrating. Lanterns were hung from every porch, their lights glowing like captured stars against the deep, velvet blue of the twilight sky. The sound of carolers, their voices clear and joyful on the cold air, drifted through the streets. A large bonfire had been lit in the center of town, a beacon of warmth and community that drew people from their homes. Caleb stood with Lydia at their window, the sleeping Thomas now resting in his cradle. They watched the scene, the small figures gathered around the fire, their laughter echoing in the night. It was a picture of perfect peace, a peace that had been bought at a terrible price, but was all the more precious for it. Lydia leaned her head against his shoulder, her hand finding his. "It is beautiful," she whispered. "Yes," he said, his arm wrapping around her, holding her close. He was no longer haunted. The ghosts of his past had been laid to rest, not by forgetting, but by the grace of forgiveness, hers and his own. He understood now that true salvation was not a prize to be won or a debt to be paid. It was the simple, terrifying, and ultimately beautiful act of learning to trust another person again, and in doing so, learning to trust yourself. She looked up at him, her eyes shining in the soft light from the room, reflecting the distant bonfire's glow. A playful, familiar smile touched her lips. "Still do not believe in Christmas, Mr. Monroe?" she asked, her voice a soft, teasing murmur. He looked down at her, at the woman who had seen the man he could be and had loved him into existence. He saw his whole world in her eyes, his past redeemed, his present full, and his future a bright and hopeful country. The smile that had once been so foreign to him now came easily, a genuine expression of the profound and quiet joy that filled his soul. He leaned down and kissed her forehead, a gesture of infinite tenderness and love. "Only if it is with you," he said. "Thank you for listening to our story tonight. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.